The gist of this lecture is there are very traditional ways to look at the spread of nuclear weapons, both in arms control contexts and in nonproliferation. And you'll hear these approaches. There are three. And let's just say they're not as helpful as people think in explaining the past, or probably in understanding the future. And that essentially we can and should try to do better if we care about reducing the spread of nuclear weapons. And that will require moving away from these three models. Now, by way of persuasion or an effort to make you believe that this might be desirable, I'm going to examine some historical cases and try to show that the models that are very popular for explaining how things work don't actually do a very good job explaining both successes and failures, and that it suggests doing something, taking on some other models when we're thinking about history or public policy making in the future. I suppose, having done that review, I should mention one other thing. When policy people want to find things, the intelligence community generally works very well and performs very well, and the policy community performs very well. And just the opposite accrues when the policy community has various reasons for not wanting to find things. And therein lies the wisdom of experience, which is, you know what experience is. Experience is what you get when you don't get what you want. So let's go to the first slide. Okay, now what you're going to be getting is a sort of a benefit of a lot of spending, both by the US government and some private foundations on the right and the left. There was a project called Speaking Truth to Nonproliferation. It was a 3-year project. And we engaged 50 senior, mid-level, and retired, and even some serving policymakers and intelligence officers. I was told that trying to gauge these people about what did and didn't work in 8 past nuclear proliferation cases, that they wouldn't come, and if they came, they wouldn't talk. And if they did talk, they wouldn't agree about anything. Well, none of those 3 predictions turned out to be true. They came, they spoke, and there was a fair amount of agreement, even though these people are ideologically very different from one another. And the cases we looked at were, India, Pakistan, Israel, Taiwan, South Korea, Libya, Argentina, and South Africa, either getting nuclear weapons, or in the case of South Africa, a very robust nuclear delivery rocket system. And it's based on months and months of group discussions and private conversations. So let's see, what did all that activity produce? Let's go to the next slide. Well, the answers to these 4 questions. What are the models for intelligence and policymaking that are relevant to promoting effective arms control and nonproliferation? How well do these models explain historical cases of nuclear proliferation? What might be the sensible additional models to help guide our efforts in intelligence and policymaking in these fields? And what would you need to support these things? Let's go to I think there are some brief answers, aren't there? Well, the brief answers are, the 3 models are, you need to be timely and actionable when you have intelligence. And you'll hear this over and over and over again if you study or you go into practical professional intelligence work. In the case of arms control, and I think to a very big extent for nonproliferation, there is a process you're supposed to follow. That's the next thing you'll be told. There's a process for detecting things and a process for verifying and acting on verifying what you've detected. And we'll show you what that process is, and you're supposed to salute and follow that. And then my favorite, this is a Kent School of Intelligence favorite. You need to maintain a wall. He actually uses that word, a wall, between policymaking and intelligence officers so that nobody fixes the facts to make policy look like it's backed by facts when they aren't there. And so those are your three models. Now, how well do they explain successes and failures of the past? Well, not very well, which I think is worth reflecting on. What would help, or what is the approach that we should be taking in addition to these models? So let's be clear, models cannot be absolutely wrong, nor can they be absolutely perfect. What you want to do is get models that help you. And if models don't work a lot, or they're not as helpful as they could, it's always useful to try to think of, some other model. I suppose that's the apologia for political science and the study of international relations, is you're supposed to help us come up with these models. So what's the model that might help that we don't currently have? Oh, working backwards from futures you want and away from futures you don't. And in the case of the spread of nuclear weapons, that would probably be, people getting along or not getting nuclear weapons, and folks getting nuclear weapons and using them on one another. So what do you need for this? You'd have to actually think that politically, all the top elite Eagle Beagles and elected officials would want to put a high priority on preventing the spread of nuclear weapons or their, accumulation where they already are. You'd have to actually want to work backwards from the future, which is bureaucratically not so easy. And then, my favorite, you'd have to strengthen academic support of government non-proliferation efforts. Why I'm talking to you, I guess. All right. So why don't we get into this? You do get, I suppose, within limits, if the question is factual or really focused, interrupt. If it's a speech, a comment that will lead us astray, I reserve the right to have Greg come to my rescue, or Professor Trevin, excuse me, I should not be that informal. Okay, let's go to the first slide. So what are the models? The first model, and you get this from, let's see, former Defense Secretaries Ash Carter actually wrote an essay for my center talking about, well, if we just had timely intelligence that was actionable, we could prevent most proliferation. So what we need is timely, actionable intelligence. Former Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld summarized this as saying, well, we need situational awareness, which is code for everything. Now, if you think this sounds a little unhinged, think again. What is it that artificial intelligence and data collection is all about? It's that with enough data and enough, algorithms and enough sensors, we can do this. Yeah, and we have big computers, and they'll tell us what's going on. They'll even predict things. All right. Well, that's one way to go. A good example would be my favorite. In the case of Libyan nuclear weapons program that we throttled and they gave up on, there was a very famous shipment on this boat to the left called the BBC China. In October of 2003, it didn't get to where it wanted to go. And as Lenin would say, this too was no accident. What happened? Well, we managed to get a tip-off in Dubai and the United Arab Emirates that, well, this ship was being loaded with centrifuge-related parts. It was German, and that it was going to go to Toronto in Italy. And lo and behold, we waited until it came into port within the jurisdiction of Italy. and we seized it, or I should say the Italians did. And this is the model. You know, you get enough information like that, no problem. The problem, I suppose, with that is, boy, is that rare. That information and tip-off came from many years of doing export control, tracking, and all sorts of things. More often, what you get isn't a specific time or place to do an interdiction, but more like the picture on the right.
Lucia, a quick question.
Yes?
Yes, sorry. I just wanted to get a little more of a grasp. So when you say to prevent nuclear proliferation, I guess from what tools is this, like, how are we going to stop people from nuclear proliferation?
Well, you know, many people contemplate doing terrible things.
Right.
They don't all succeed. Some of them, before they get to the bank, are picked up.
Okay.
Or their gun is blown out of their hand. Or, you know, we have guards and police and snitches. And the world is not simply the case where folks get to do whatever they imagine. There are a lot of steps along the way, and they can stumble or get caught out. Now,
Sorry,
that is...
So are we mean by nuclear proliferation, we mean nuclear proliferation by states, right?
Yes, yes. And, you know, it is not the case that you can necessarily succeed at just doing interdiction. You want to probably appeal to the motives as well and work that. But, you know, you do a lot of different things, and this is part of it.
Okay.
Does that...
This will probably become clear in the cases.
Okay.
Well, it might. It might. So more often than not, you don't have that kind of intelligence. You know something might happen somewhere. Keep in mind, if you do reading, which I recommend, it sounds snarky and sarcastic, but I teach. A lot of students don't do it, and all I can say is good luck, and, you know, please don't get near me. But if you do reading, you'll probably encounter a really great study by Roberta Wohlstetter on Pearl Harbor, where we knew something was going to happen and we had some information, but there was so much noise and not enough signal. We didn't know exactly what. We got hit.
Yeah, we worked over that. That was one of our good.
Well, good, because life is more like that than the BBC China.
Okay.
Okay, so next slide. Well, the next, I'd say, model or approach or thing you get taught is, if you're going to worry about arms control or non-proliferation, you need to know something. I've given it a name, but bureaucratically, you know, I don't think it has a name, but it works like this. It's called the proliferation, or, you know, arms control, violation, detection, verification, timeline, continuum. I got this from somebody who wanted that to be the name, and I thought, well, it's awkward. No one will adopt it. I'll use it. But it is, in fact, how our government works. In some way or another, we or other governments, or even the UN, will set limits of some sort, red lines, for behavior or transactions. Then there will be efforts unilaterally and multilaterally to detect possible violations. Then there is this process of, okay, someone says we've detected a possible violation. We political technical authorities will meet, you know, sometimes at the IEA or the UN Security Council or at the NSC or other government locations, and we will convince ourselves one way or the other if this detection is for real or not. Then we'll take some kind of enforcement action. It could be everything from military strikes to what lovingly was referred to in the 1980s as the marshmallows or marshes, which I think got a raw judgment from conservatives. I say this as someone who used to use the term as a conservative. I mean, sometimes telling people what you know is enough to shut a program down. So, you know, there's a continuum, and you need to go through all these steps. And don't jump to number 3 if you haven't done number 1 and number 2, and you better follow the process. Okay, what's the third model? My favorite. Policy should not try to tell intelligence people what the facts are. They should not fix the facts, which is the title of the book. And what you do is you put the policymaker in between the policy. I mean, the policymaker needs to be in between policy staff and intelligence staff, maybe sitting on top of the wall, and listen to both the policymakers and the intelligence people, but make sure that the intelligence people aren't contaminated or stained by the perverse desires of the policy community, and that the intelligence is entirely neo-Kantian objective. Yeah, this is a kind of German form of intelligence political science, I would say. But you know, it has a certain appeal politically. Okay, those are the 3 models. You can well imagine if you thought, and I think there's enough raw material to work with to make arguments that, you know, in the case of the war against Iraq, and certainly in the second go around, everyone wanted to find evidence of weapons of mass destruction, and were leaning on the intelligence community to say that they had found them or that there was evidence. And turned out the evidence wasn't quite as solid as people thought it was. And that was very embarrassing. A lot of people in the intelligence community argue, well, that's not really right. We didn't, you know, we weren't leading the witness. So a lot of controversy, but that's where this wall idea takes on, you know, some historical relevance, and so keep that in mind. All right, so let's go to the next slide if we can. Well, I'm not going to go through all the cases, but I'm going to pick 2 or 3. And my favorite is Israel, because this is a case where if you don't want to know something, it doesn't matter what you know. You're not going to act on it. And I think it's generally argued that the Israeli case was one in which the intelligence community failed. Yeah, that they came to the conclusion that Israel had a nuclear program too late to stop it. I think that's pretty unpersuasive, and a few other, commentators who write long books, say this as well. But what's interesting is in talking to a lot of practitioners involved in this case, I think there's a pretty strong case that isn't really how things unfolded. Why do I say that? I think it's because we had pretty good evidence early on that there was some kind of program going on. In particular, the deal between France and I'm looking for my notes. Can you imagine looking at notes? All right. Even the lecturer looks at notes occasionally. The French in 57 agreed secretly with Israel to build what was essentially a military plutonium production reactor that was almost identical in all of its basic respects to the one France had. And this was part of a deal that had to do with the Suez crisis. And again, reading will set you free, as they say. You look that up. You just do a Wikipedia look at that. It's a fascinating piece of history. And it explains an awful lot of current events still. In any case, because of the assistance the Israelis gave the British and French, to varying degrees, the French and the British helped Israel get a bomb as a sort of payback. And that deal was cut in I'd say, I want to say late 57. I have here October. There are various ways of cutting this. Construction began. Well, first of all, we didn't really learn about it according to conventional history. They say, and confirmed it until 61. That's not quite right. Actually, early in 58, which is just like maybe 4 months after this secret agreement, there was an embassy report that we needed to be on the lookout for a possible nuclear program and that such an agreement may have been reached. But far more interesting to me is that early in 58, we had U-2 photographs. U-2 is a reference to a big spy plane that went very high. And they were looking for something else in this area and saw the excavations for construction. And, you know, some accounts say it was blurry, but the most recent account by the fellow who saw the photograph first and interpreted it, a guy named Dino Brugiani, which is a terrific name, I think, at the CIA, says they were pretty darn clear. In fact, they were so clear, they looked identical to the plant in France. And he immediately said, hey, this is a plutonium production plant. It's French. And the most interesting part of this is the head of the CIA was briefed, but it wasn't just the head of the CIA. Eisenhower was briefed. He couldn't have shown less interest. He waved it away. It wasn't that he didn't know about it. If anything, it seemed as though he knew about it before he saw the photographs. That was in 58. Well, why is 58 important? Well, in 58, there was a Ben-Gurion, who was president of Israel, was pleading with the United States to get basically a big arms shipment and a security guarantee. One must wonder what would have happened if we gave a security guarantee and the arms and said, shut that damn thing down. What would have happened? I have no idea, but anybody who thinks it's obvious that the Israelis would have ignored that is blowing smoke up your tail as well. It's one of those questions which inquiring historians have got to ponder. I think, in fact, the way to characterize the Israeli case is we knew plenty, and we chose not to take on what we knew with regard to policy implications. There are a variety of reasons for this, which we'll get into. But there's lots of evidence in Norway in, I want to say, February of 59, they struck a deal. You know, we knew about it not that much longer after that. Well, what do you use heavy water for? Well, for a heavy water reactor. You know, the idea that that was just something that, you know, wasn't important, you know, that's ridiculous. I mean, they had reason to know. Then there was, you know, materials sent from Argentina, which is basically uranium. It took, you know, about 24 months to find that out. And you could say, well, you know, that's a terrible long lag. You know, I would say for government work or even non-governmental work, that's pretty good. Not only that, but in 63, Ben-Gurion gave, you know, was more or less left office because Kennedy was pushing him to stop the bomb project. And he felt like he had to resign because it was getting hot and heavy. Eshkol, who replaced him, agreed to inspections. Now, these inspections by the United States of the Dimona plant, which you can see there to the left, the CIA pretty much said, well, you know, they're not all that forthcoming. They did lie to them. They did not show them all of the facility. What is also interesting, though, and we'll get to this later, for some reason, the CIA chose to send people to do the inspection, none of whom knew Hebrew. Now, I know there's plenty to argue that during this period, the CIA might have been mildly to highly, I don't know, depends what your view is, anti-Semitic. But come on, I mean, they had people who knew Hebrew. If they wanted to send people who knew Hebrew, they chose not to. I find that, you know, the dog that didn't bark as a piece of inconclusive evidence that something was a little off here. We'll get back to that. Then there were also all these other things, German shipments, plumbat, that we discovered, became aware of. It got to the point where in '69, there was a conscious understanding that we would look the other way, that we would no longer push for the inspections. And Nixon and Golda Meir met. And, I'm not sure they had a formal agreement. A lot of people think that. They have no proof. We have no record, really, of that happening. But the logic was, it wasn't in our interest to say they had it, and it wasn't in Israel's interest to say they had it, because if they did, Egypt and the Soviets would be on edge trying to catch up. So, it kind of was swept under the rug. Meanwhile, there was lots of evidence that the Israelis stole, like up to several hundred pounds of highly enriched weapons grade uranium over a period of time. And then, if anyone had any doubts, in '86, someone who worked at Dimona took pictures basically of the bomb that they were making. So, I mean, to this day, it is the case the United States does not admit that it knows for sure that Israel has nuclear weapons. Now that, really is fantastic stuff. Go to the next slide. If it was just that, it would be pretty bad, but it gets worse. And this is important for our storyboard about, if you want to know, it's one thing, and if you don't, it doesn't matter what the evidence is. In '79, there was an explosion off the South African coast. There's a terrific series about this in Foreign Policy. I believe that was in 2019 on the exact same date as this flash. You should go look it up. Terrific, short, brief, concise series of scientific and political essays about what this was about. One of the things that happened is we had satellites called VELA satellites that had what were called bang meters, which were infrared meters. And they were designed to notice what's called the double hump, or you can see double humps here. What is this? Can you see me? Because I can't see myself. Can I be seen? Hello?
Yeah, you can.
As you can be
Okay.
seen, yes.
All right. When a nuclear explosion goes off, it releases energy, and if it's released in the air or near the surface, it expands outward like a ball of fire, and it expands so quickly that on the outside edge of the expanding ball, it compresses the air. So first that happens is the explosion occurs, there's a release of energy, and you'll notice there's a climb upward on the left-hand side of each one of these double humps. And that's the energy, infrared energy and the other kinds of energy that the bang meter detects. And then what happens is the air around the fireball gets compressed so much that it masks or hides the release of energy that's pushing it outward. It's like, if you have enough compressed air, it's like a shield of sorts for the signal. So it goes down. But as the ball expands further, the ability of that compressed air to hide the signal goes away, and then the hump goes up. The amount of light that the meter sees goes up. And then, of course, as the ball, it goes all the way out, there's less and less energy that can be detected. It's no longer as intense, and it goes down again. This is called a double hump. Now, what's interesting is the light pattern to the right is what the bang meter on our VELA satellite saw. And the one on the left is, I think, a French nuclear test, but it's a known pattern from a known test. You'll notice they're similar. Yeah, they are similar, but it wasn't just that. In Puerto Rico, there's a telescope that looks for ionic waves, and the disturbance there was very similar to other atmospheric tests. Oh, by the way, the VELA satellite picks up not just light, but X-rays, gamma rays, and neutron emissions. So I mean, it's a fairly sophisticated system. Then on top of this, the Naval Research Labs for the United States Navy were, they've been looking to understand how to listen in the water. Why? Well, submarines, we have to have anti-submarine capability. Well, but in addition, they have hydroacoustic systems that know when a test is occurring. Let's say the French test in Polynesia, they have a water, a near water test. Those signal patterns that they picked up for known nuclear tests were very similar to what was set off the South African coast. In fact, initially the intelligence community said, well, we have a high confidence that this is a nuclear test. But then the policymakers got involved. What was going on at the time? Oh, well, two things. The president, Jimmy Carter, was pushing something called the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks 2, SALT 2. He's trying to get the Senate to approve it.
Well, we seem to have hung up, huh?
Was a nuclear test. How in the world could he sell the SALT 2 treaty on the basis that he could confirm that? On the other hand, if he did confirm it, that would be pretty bad, and I'll tell you why. Israel had signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited them from doing this. So he was conflicted. Not only that, but he was trying to get a peace deal between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And it wouldn't do that he would hide the Israelis cheating on a nuclear restriction. That would look bad for striking the deal. On the other hand, confirming that they had exploded this device would put the Arabs off on striking any deal with Israel. So what do you do in government when you're conflicted and you're a little bit being pushed by a lot of information that suggests you may not have an easy way out? Well, nobody knows. You call for a study. You have to study this. I mean, they called for an alternative explanation. Now, more recently, I think at the beginning of the Trump administration, there was a press secretary, Ms. Conway, who talked about, well, we have alternative facts. Well, it's sort of the same thing. We need alternative explanations. And they came up with one. The alternative explanation was this bang meter was old and it got spooked. It could have been spooked by some cosmic dust and the sun hitting at a certain angle. Now, one intelligence agency tried to put odds on this. And of course, some people say, well, yeah, but I'm not sure how scientific their odd making was. I think they said there was, does anybody know what the odds of this happening were? We should have, how many students are in this listening?
40.
40. All right, now the role of a student is to guess. And the reason you have to learn how to guess is most of policy making is run by people like me who go to meetings and they assert things, and sometimes, well, they guess. So in the spirit of policy making and the study of policy making, can someone guess what the odds were according to these intelligence critics who were in the intelligence community about what the odds of this alternative explanation were? One in how many?
1 million.
Well, now wait a minute. Was that Professor Treverton who spoke?
Yes.
Yeah, no, you're disqualified. You don't count. Okay.
Henry, can you do about 20 more minutes? We are
Yes.
running short of time.
Yes. Does anybody know? 100 million. No, 100 billion. Now, that apparently was good enough for government work, and they liked the explanation, and they ran with it. One of the reasons they got away with it, I think, is someone pointed out, well, there should have been fallout, which is normally see that in Australia, and they actually were testing or looking for that radiation by looking for what was in the thyroid of slaughtered sheep. And someone went back recently in the last 5-6 years to look at that data, and lo and behold, the data actually was quite strong. At the time they said it was weak. It actually was quite strong. So, you know, go to the next slide. It just seems to me that this was a case where the US didn't act despite relatively timely actionable intelligence. You know, not because we had it, but because not because we didn't have it, but because we probably did, because I think we could have probably done something in 58 that might well have borne, you know, some fruit. I can't prove it, but you know, Eshkol also asked for a security assurance. Kennedy gave it, but it by then in 63, you know, there was a problem. He got assassinated. And I think the Israelis more or less said, well, we're so close to the bomb, you know, we just have to go ahead. Now, here, intelligence and the limits, you know, in the test ban treaty, threshold test ban, were not just ignored, they were denied. I mean, the Ruana panel, which is what I described, actually, I think, kind of ended up being useful for things less than what they were arguing for. They said, well, this is conceivable, that's what we were asked. But in fact, it was used to help deny that, you know, there was any need to do anything. I don't think policymakers cooked intelligence. You know, this, you know, wasn't that the wall, you know, wasn't there so much as the policymakers explained away the intelligence that they got. Ultimately, also the intelligence community may have chosen to pull their punch. I mentioned the Hebrew problem. When this was brought up, a senior official who was involved said, I've always thought the intelligence community knew a lot more about the Israeli nuclear program than they ever were willing to tell us. And when we asked him why he thought that, he said, well, they have to protect their connections with the Israelis. And why would they blow it when they knew we weren't about to do anything with the information anyway? I cannot prove this, but this is something that was said. Now, if this seems unique, think again. There are similarities that are with the Indian, Pakistani, Iraqi, Iranian, and North Korean nuclear cases, where we kind of hide the ball. I would add now Saudi Arabia, where certain things were only let loose after a lot of yelling and screaming, although the time lag was much shorter from Congress. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, counterpoint. In the case of Taiwan and South Korea, because of some laws that had been passed after we winked at what India did, which is take some assistance we gave them and made a bomb with it, and nothing happened. And we were told, well, they would only use it for peaceful purposes. And when they set the bomb off using our heavy water and a lot of our reprocessing design information, they said, well, it was a peaceful nuclear explosive, which is, I guess, shows that the Indians have a profound sense of humor. In any case, we weren't going to let that happen again. And when laws were passed and yelling and screaming went on, we acted pretty quickly when we got some tips about Taiwan and South Korea. Those programs were throttled. Now, I think we can go to the next slide. Well, why were, what happened in those cases? We acted on first indications right away, well before the intelligence was all that clear, much less actionable. And clearly before there was anything close to a weapon or even a complete reactor. There hardly were any violations of any clear red lines. The weapons manufacturer was still years off. In each of these successful cases, there was incredibly close cooperation, not much of a wall between intelligence officers and policymakers, both at the scene and back in Washington. Each other's information informed each other's work. Now, I think that helps explain the successful cases that we looked at. The Libyan case, where we were able to interdict and throttle and anticipate the political efforts and desires of Gaddafi, and two rocket nuclear cases, Condor II and the SA-1 program in Argentina and South Africa. Okay, let's go to the next model. Slide, next slide. Okay, well, what might help? Well, the obvious, and you've probably heard other people argue this. This is no longer a very original point. Act as soon as you can. They call this acting to the left of boom. Okay, you don't want to wait until 5 or 6. You want to get to 1 or even 0. Okay, let's go to the next slide. How do you do that? Well, you don't wait for actually pictures or signals or intercepts. What you do is you sit down with a policymaker and you ask, what futures do you want? What futures do you not want? They will describe a region that might come around to being more Pacific for a variety of reasons, because of economics, security understandings, the death of somebody, for God's sakes. I mean, any number of factors could come to mind. And they will describe how badly things might go with nuclear weapons spreading on top of it. You then work backwards from those two imagined futures and say, well, what would be the indications that we're going away from the future we want and towards the future we don't, or versa versa? All right. And then you set up intelligence requirements. And you start looking at these things and you start trying to push things with your policies in the direction of the future you want and away from the future you don't want. And you keep iterating your intelligence requirements to help support that kind of policy area. You need to have country-specific, what I call competitive strategies to avoid the worst and to achieve the best. All right, next slide. What's needed to support this? Well, you got to give, proliferation, whether it's, the accumulation of arms in existing places or the spread to new ones, priority. Over the last 30 years, congressional oversight, unfortunately, has gone way down. They used to have committees with the names proliferation or non-proliferation in them. They don't now, except one that has it among many other names. They used to have reports that were annual. They got rid of all those. You might want to change that up. You might want to have staff that full-time works these things, which they used to, but they don't now. You need to make it part of defense guidance, which is this thing that supposedly tells us what our threats are and what kinds of forces we need. I can tell you the spread of nuclear weapons is not in there, and it needs to be. After all, the guidance is for buying things that take 20 years to buy and keeping people in the services for 2 decades. Well, what's going to happen in 20 years ought to be in there as well. In this regard, it might be useful to game. The last time we did this seriously in multiple moves of any real substantive merit was with Ronald Reagan. That's about 30 to 40 years ago. We might kind of dust that off and try again. Next item. There was an attempt to work backwards. I don't think it worked. It was a strategic assessment group that was created at CIA. I know this because I was asked to advise and oversee some of the activities. The problem was the policymakers didn't want to play. And they didn't want to play because they didn't want to be caught saying what they wanted to do, for fear that if they didn't succeed at it, their careers would be ruined, which tells you an awful lot about the shortcomings of ambitious people. But you could recreate it, and maybe you could develop some gaming. I think this is done a bit more, but it isn't done formally. You could try to do more. Whether you need to create a group, I think you do, but bureaucratic insiders might have different insights. Maybe you could use an existing group. There's something called the Strategic Interdiction Group. Maybe you could use them. I don't have a dog in that fight. You need to offer opportunities for long-term joint instruction between intelligence and policymakers. As far as I know, that isn't done very much. I offer a course on the Hill where I consciously go after these people. It's an unclassified course. It does not encourage specific planning for specific countries or regions. I think you need to do that, summer studies or something like that. Last slide. You need to bring the has-beens to the wannabes. Why I'm here, I'm a has-been. I hate to refer to the experience level, which is much higher, of your professor, but you're lucky. I mean, he actually has experience, which is what you get when you don't get exactly what you want. And he knows things that are not written in books. You want to get those people out talking to people, because most of what's most interesting in policy making doesn't get written down in books ever, or very, very late. We need to create a repository of oral histories of people like your professor. Academia can play a hand. We should support long-term government, legislative, and executive internships. I think this is happening, actually. I'm not so sure that's so necessary, but more can be done. And then my top complaint, we need to reform security regulations and classification regulations so people can tell their story, and young people can do research and ask questions and get the answers. That's it.